you are an idiot. If you want to learn a language as fast as possible, and I'm not talking about like YouTube polyglot, learn a language in 24 hours. I'm talking about actually efficient language learning in as little time as possible. You have to pick an easy language as a beginner, but also one that is ideally cool and useful too. So this video is basically a guide for the best languages for beginners to learn, why, how, and everything else you need to know. And I'm also going to give my personal recommendation and a little bit of advice for which languages are best, and just to kind of help you out, because the internet, I've found, is just a complete cesspit of garbage. So yeah, stick around until the end to know exactly how long it will take you to learn a language as well. First, why bother actually starting easy, and do you even need to start with an easy language? Well, the answer to the second question is no. You don't. You can start with a more difficult language. However, it's obviously going to be more difficult. So if you have a specific reason, such as a family member, or you need to travel to that country, then obviously it doesn't make sense to start with French if you need to learn Mandarin. Just learn Mandarin and just, it'll take a bit longer and it'll be difficult, but you have a reason to do that. If you don't have a reason, which I think is most people, it doesn't really make sense to start with a super difficult language, because it's just going to take longer. It's going to be more difficult. You're going to be demotivated. And language learning is hard enough as it is. So the classroom failure rate for language learning is already above 99%. Plus, most people just have a fixed mindset, I've found. So just trust me, it is much, much better to start with an easier language. Go harder later. You will be able to do harder languages one day, but trust me, it's worth the wait. So how do we actually know which languages are easy to learn? I found there's one number one indicator of difficulty, and that is how similar the language is to your native language. So if you're a native English speaker, for example, you'd be looking for languages that have similar vocab, which means words, similar grammar, which means kind of like the rules of the language, and other little things like expressions, accent, etc. can make it easier to learn if it's more similar. For an English speaker, this basically gives us 8 different languages across 2 different language branches: French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Dutch, and Afrikaans. Technically, there are 3 more languages we could consider, but they're a little bit harder, so we'll talk about them later. These languages are all the easiest languages because they're similar to English. They're spread between 2 branches, the Romance languages and the Germanic languages. But hold on a second. English is technically a Germanic language, so does this mean that the Germanic languages are easier? Well, not necessarily. The Germanic languages are more closely related to English, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're more similar. I like to think about it like your friends versus your siblings. You're more closely related to your siblings, but you're not necessarily more similar to your siblings because you might spend more time with your friends. That's kind of how languages work as well. Even though 2 languages might be more closely related than a 3rd language, a native speaker of one of those 2 close languages might actually find it easier to learn the more distant language if those languages are more similar because of shared vocab and increased similarity. English actually borrows a lot of words, as you probably know, from Latin, and Latin is the language that the Romance languages are descended from, which means they are also very easy for English speakers to learn. Of these languages I've just said, Norwegian is supposedly the easiest, with Dutch and Spanish close behind, although this is heavily influenced by individual preference, and all of these languages are very easy. The hardest of which is probably French, which you might be surprised to hear. This is because French is less similar to Latin than the other Romance languages, and it also has difficult pronunciation and orthographic depth. But don't worry, all of these languages are pretty easy. At this point, I should probably mention the other 3 languages. So the other 3 languages I was going to talk about were German, Icelandic, and Romanian. These 3 languages aren't particularly hard, but they are significantly harder than the rest and have a few other difficulties. German is much less similar to English than Dutch. Icelandic is supposedly harder for Nordics to understand than the other Nordic languages, plus it has some complicated grammar that the other languages have ditched over time. And Romanian, although being a Romance language, it has been significantly influenced by Russian grammar and Russian words, and it is a little bit more whack. But hold on, this video is about the best languages, not necessarily the easiest. So we also have to consider how many speakers to determine how useful the language is and how easy it is to find resources. And also, will it suit you even if you don't need it per se? Even if you don't need a language to speak to a family member or for work or for travel, it's still fun learning a language, and you should pick a language that is going to be fun for you to speak. Here are the languages on screen with the amount of speakers they have. And as you can clearly see, French, Spanish, and Portuguese have the most. All of these languages do have a lot of learning material. However, these have the most, and that's important because variety is key. The more resources available for a language, the more potential teachers, the more YouTube channels, the more websites, etc. And that is going to benefit you overall. There are also potentially more opportunities to speak this language, and of course that depends on the country you live in. But generally, if there's more speakers of a language, there's more speakers of a language, and you're going to be more likely to encounter someone who can actually speak that language. But it depends on where you live. You should also definitely consider just which language seems the best for you. If it sounds like a language you want to learn, if you like the country, if you like the culture, if you like the stuff like movies, books, TV, even the flag, you might draw you towards a language. Just whatever language seems the most fun is probably going to be a better bet, because at the end of the day, if you don't have a reason to learn a language, you're going to give up when you don't feel like it, and nobody wants that. Now it's time for my personal recommendation. If you're still here, good, because this is kind of a bit of an important part. First, let me just say all these languages are fantastic, and you should pick the one you want, regardless of which one I say is best. At the end of the day, the language you feel is best for you, because you're going to put the most effort into learning it. However, there are some people who will leak my address if I don't give my opinion, so I'm just going to say which languages I think are the best. The best language is Chinese. I kind of have to give 3 recommendations for 3 different reasons, and you can decide which one is best for you. So as far as the easiest language overall, I haven't actually learnt this, so I can't confirm it, but it's probably Norwegian. Just the consensus seems to be that Norwegian is the easiest language for English speakers to learn, but there's also debate around Spanish, Afrikaans, Dutch, and probably more as well, so you do you. The second would be the most resources, obviously Spanish, because it has the most speakers. I believe it has the most resources on Duolingo. I don't know who cares about that. But yeah, overall Spanish just seems to have the most resources, and personally, if it was between Spanish and Norwegian, I know I'd be learning Spanish. And my third recommendation would be the language I learned first, which is Italian. It was pretty fun, it was pretty easy, it was a cool language, it just sounds good, and it's actually quite similar to Latin. It's the most similar to Latin, which means if you're going to learn more Romance languages, starting with Italian can actually be useful because it will be easier going forward. So just a fun little thing there. My advice would be, don't obsess over the easiest language, because they're all easy. It just doesn't matter. Just pick the language that is going to be the most fun for you and appeals to you, and just commit to learning that one. As a bonus, how long does it actually take to learn a language? Well, it does depend. It really depends on how much effort you put in. So if for an easy language, you can generally learn it within 2 years. Any of the languages on this list, you could probably learn within 2 years. I know for me, was conversational in Italian after about 18 months of learning, and it wasn't like super strict, but it wasn't like I was doing nothing. I did slack sometimes, but I was able to do it with fairly consistent learning in 18 months. So yeah, don't buy into the like, I'm gonna learn a language in 24 hours. It's certainly not true. Just enjoy yourself and give it your all. And if you like that advice, then I like you too, and make sure to hit the subscribe button. Guys, I've got links in the description to my coaching as well, which you should definitely check out for beginner language learners, and my Discord. Check out my video on the 7 stages of language learning, and have a good one.